They called him the Iron Dawn. Cassiano Moretti didn't just rule the city's underworld, he owned its very pulse. He was a man with an iron mask for a face and a stone vault where his heart should be. His word was absolute, and his mercy was a myth that had died decades ago. The rule at Loro di Napoli was simple: total silence when the Dawn dined. But on a humid Thursday, Eloane, an exhausted waitress working a double shift, stumbled. The scalding minestrone soup erupted across Cassiano's $10,000 bespoke suit. The restaurant froze. Eloane's heart stopped as three of Moretti's enforcers stood in a blur of motion, the metallic clicks of their handguns disengaging echoing against the marble columns. She squeezed her eyes shut, her hands flying to her mouth, waiting for the cold lead that would end her life right there among the white linen tables. But the gunshot never came. Instead, she heard something impossible. The sound of a heavy chair dragging backward. When Eloane opened her eyes, the most dangerous man in the country wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was slumped in his seat, his head bowed low over the mess of spilled broth and steam. And on his face, for the first time in 20 years, were shimmering, broken tears. "Mama," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry earth. It's her. Why would the ruthless Iron Dawn collapse in grief over a bowl of soup spilled by a stranger? What is the secret buried in a recipe from a small Italian village, and why does this waitress hold the key to the Mafia's most guarded secret? What do you think is hidden in Eloane's past? Share your predictions in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video if you're gripped by the mystery of the Iron Dawn. Tell us where you are watching from, and hit that subscribe button to see how this legend unfolds. The air inside Loro di Napoli was thick with the scent of truffle oil and the quiet, rhythmic clinking of silver against crystal, but the atmosphere shifted the second the heavy oak doors groaned open. It wasn't a sudden noise that announced him, but a silence that rippled through the room like a cold front. Don Cassiano Moretti stepped into the light, a man whose presence felt like a glacier moving through a summer garden. He was draped in a black bespoke suit that seemed to swallow the ambient glow of the chandeliers, his face a mask of chiseled, unmoving granite. Behind him, three men followed, shadows in identical dark tailoring, their eyes scanning the room with the clinical detachment of predators. Every conversation in the restaurant died a sudden death. A socialite froze with a wine glass halfway to her lips, a businessman lowered his head, suddenly fascinated by his steak. Cassiano didn't look at them. He didn't have to. He walked with a steady, deliberate pace that spoke of a man who had never encountered an obstacle he couldn't break. To the city, he was the Iron Dawn, a myth of merciless retribution who had long ago traded his humanity for a throne of steel. Eloane Brooks stood in the shadows of the service station, her fingers trembling as she adjusted her apron. She had heard the stories, everyone in the neighborhood had, but seeing him was different. He looked less like a man and more like a force of nature, cold and inevitable. Her manager had whispered a frantic warning in the kitchen: no eye contact, no mistakes, no delays. Eloane took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to steady the tray in her hands. She was coming off a double shift, her legs heavy and her mind clouded by exhaustion, but she couldn't afford a single slip-up. Not with a man who was rumored to have cleared entire city blocks just to settle a grudge. Cassiano reached his table, the center of the room, yet isolated by a ring of empty chairs that no one dared to occupy. He sat, his movements fluid and efficient, his hands resting on the white linen like carved mahogany. He didn't look at the menu, he knew what he wanted. He wanted the only thing that reminded him of a time before the blood and the iron. As Eloane began her slow, nervous walk toward the center of the room, the steam from the large ceramic bowl of minestrone rose to meet her face. The scent was rich and herbal, a sharp contrast to the sterile, cold aura radiating from the man in the black suit. The enforcers stepped back, flanking the dawn like silent gargoyles, their hands hovering near the waistlines of their jackets. The stage was set for a routine evening of fear, but as Eloane's foot caught the edge of a stray chair leg, the iron world of Cassiano Moretti was about to shatter. The heavy ceramic bowl felt like a lead weight in Eloan's slick palms as she stepped into the dead air surrounding the Don's table. Every eye in the restaurant was a physical pressure against her back, but the Iron Don himself remained motionless, a statue of terrifying indifference. She reached the edge of the linen, the steam from the soup rising in a fragrant, herbal cloud that seemed to belong to a different world than the cold, sterile man before her. Then, it happened. Her worn work shoe caught the leg of a chair, a tiny, inconsequential snag that shifted the universe. Time slowed to a crawl. Eloan felt the tray tilt, the center of gravity vanishing as the bowl slid toward the edge with agonizing slowness. She lunged to catch it, but her fingers only brushed the hot porcelain, sending it into a chaotic spin. The minestrone erupted, a plume of scarlet broth and garden vegetables arching through the air before slamming into the chest of Cassiano Moretti's black bespoke suit. The sound of the splash was as loud as a gunshot in the silent hall. Eloan's breath hitched in a jagged sob, her hands flying to her mouth in a gesture of pure, primal terror. She stood frozen, watching the dark, oily stain spread across the fabric that cost more than her year's rent. Behind the Don, the three enforcers moved with the synchronized precision of a firing squad. The metallic snick-click of three semi-automatic handguns disengaging their safeties echoed off the marble columns like the ticking of a death clock. Red laser dots danced across Eloan's white shirt, centering over her heart. I'm so sorry, she whispered, the words trembling and thin. Please. I didn't mean. She squeezed her eyes shut, pulling her shoulders in and waiting for the inevitable. She expected the roar of muzzle flashes or the cold command for her removal, a repeat of the stories where people left Moretti's presence only in an ambulance. But the air remained still. There was no shout, no strike, and no violence. Instead, a strange, sharp scent began to fill the space between them, not just the smell of the soup, but something deeper, something ancient. The Iron Don, the man who had ordered executions without a flicker of hesitation, didn't reach for a napkin or a weapon. He sat perfectly still as the scalding liquid dripped onto the floor, his hands gripped so tightly on the armrests that the leather groaned. A low, shuddering breath escaped his lips, a sound of profound, shattering recognition that paralyzed every guard in the room. The $10,000 mistake hadn't triggered a massacre, it had triggered a ghost. The silence that followed was heavier than any threat. The steam rising from Cassiano's chest carried more than the scent of garlic and basil, it carried the weight of a world long forgotten. For the Iron Don, the restaurant around him had ceased to exist. The marble columns, the terrified patrons, and the guns aimed at Eloan's heart blurred into a gray haze. All he could see was a small, sun-drenched kitchen in a village far across the sea, and a woman with flour on her apron whose smile was the only light he had ever truly known. Cassiano's hands, usually steady enough to hold a weapon without a tremor, began to shake. He didn't brush away the broth that stained his white silk shirt. Instead, he leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the mess as if it were a holy relic. A single, jagged sob tore through his throat, a sound so raw and guttural that the enforcers behind him visibly recoiled. Their fingers stayed on their triggers, but their confusion was absolute. They were waiting for a command to kill, yet their king was falling apart over a bowl of soup. Eloan watched through a veil of tears as the Don's head began to sink. The man who had cleared city blocks with a whisper was now collapsing into himself. The iron mask didn't just crack, it shattered, revealing a depth of agony that no one in the underworld knew he possessed. He looked up at her, and for the first time, Eloan didn't see a predator. She saw a boy lost in the dark. His eyes were bloodshot, swimming with a grief that had been bottled up for 20 years, now flowing as freely as the spilled liquid on the table. "Where?" he managed to choke out, his voice breaking into 1,000 pieces. "Where did you get this?" He didn't wait for her answer. He reached out, his hand hovering over the spilled soup, his fingers trembling as they touched the warmth of the broth. The salt, the wild oregano, only she knew. Only she made it like this. The enforcers exchanged frantic, worried glances. To them, this was a security breach, a moment of lethal vulnerability. To the rest of the room, it was a miracle or a nightmare. But to Cassiano, it was the first time he had breathed in 2 decades. The scent was a bridge back to a life before the blood, before the iron, and before the loneliness. As the first hot tear fell from his cheek and disappeared into the stained fabric of his suit, the Iron Dawn did the one thing his enemies thought impossible: he surrendered to his own heart. The predator was gone, and in his place sat a man finally coming home. Eloan stood trembling, her hands still pressed against her mouth as if to keep her soul from escaping. The guns were still leveled at her, but the men holding them were paralyzed by the sight of their king's collapse. She looked down at the man who was supposed to be a monster, seeing only a hollowed-out shell filled with a sudden, violent grief. Her voice, when it finally found its way through her constricted throat, was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the heavy silence of the restaurant like a blade. It was the journal, she breathed, her eyes never leaving the Dawn's bowed head. I found it in the basement of this building, hidden behind a loose brick in the old pantry. It was wrapped in oilcloth, stained with age and tears, I think. Cassiano's head snapped up. His face was a map of devastation, the dark tracks of his tears glistening under the chandelier's light. The journal, he rasped, his voice a ghost of its former authority. Eloan nodded frantically, desperate to explain the magic that had accidentally unmade him. It's a handwritten book. Most of the pages are recipes for bread and sauces, but the back is filled with letters to a son. A son named Cassie. The soup, the minestrone, it was the last entry. She called it, the soup for a brave heart. She wrote that it was the only thing that could warm a soul against the cold of the world. The enforcers shifted, the mention of the Dawn's childhood name, a name buried under decades of blood and iron, sending a shockwave through them. But Cassiano didn't care about his reputation anymore. He reached out, his fingers trembling as he touched the edge of Eloan's apron, not with aggression, but with a desperate, reaching need. You didn't just cook it, he whispered, a strange realization dawning in his eyes. You followed the notes in the margins. The wild oregano from the hills. The 3 pinches of sea salt added only when the broth begins to whistle. The way the carrots are sliced thin enough to see the light through them. I did, Eloan replied, her fear slowly being replaced by an overwhelming sense of pity. I thought the recipe was lost to time. I didn't know. I didn't know it belonged to you. It didn't belong to me, Cassiano said, finally standing up, though he looked nothing like the predator who had walked in. He looked like a man who had been wandering in a desert for 20 years and had finally found a drop of rain. He ignored the soup dripping from his expensive suit, ignored the cameras, and ignored his enemies. It was the only piece of her I had left, and I thought I had forgotten the smell of it. I thought I had forgotten her. He turned to his lead enforcer, his eyes suddenly sharp with a new, terrifyingly clear purpose. Lower the weapons, he commanded. The guns dropped instantly. Cassiano looked back at Eloan, his expression a mix of reverence and protective fire. This woman is no longer a waitress. She is the keeper of the only sacred thing left in this city. If a single hair on her head is harmed, I will burn this world to the ground to keep her warm. The proclamation hung in the air, vibrating against the marble columns like a physical weight. Cassiano stood tall, though the soup still dripped from his lapel, anointing his expensive suit with the humble scent of home. He turned his gaze toward Marco, his head of security, a man whose face was a map of scars and whose loyalty was forged in blood. Marco's hand was still hovering near the holster of his weapon, his eyes darting between the weeping Dawn and the trembling waitress. Marco, Cassiano's voice was no longer a broken rasp, it had returned to a low, lethal hum. From this moment, your orders have changed. You are not my shadow. You are hers. Marco blinked, the confusion on his face threatening to break through his professional mask. Don Cassiano, the syndicate is meeting at the docks tonight. We are exposed. We should leave before. I don't care about the docks, Cassiano interrupted, stepping into Marco's personal space. The intensity in the Don's eyes was no longer the cold vacuum of a killer, but the burning conviction of a man who had found his soul. You will handpick 4 of our best. They will stay at this restaurant. They will walk alone to her door. They will watch her windows. If a shadow moves toward her without her permission, you will end it. Do you understand? Marco looked at Eloan, then back at his boss. He saw the wet tracks on Cassiano's cheeks and the protective stance he took in front of the girl. Slowly, Marco bowed his head. As you command, Don. Cassiano turned back to Eloan. The restaurant was still a vacuum of silence, the other diners watching the transformation of a tyrant in real time. He reached into the inner pocket of his ruined jacket and pulled out a heavy, gold-plated signet ring, the symbol of his authority in the Moretti family. He pressed it into Eloan's palm, his fingers lingering against her skin with a gentleness that felt foreign to his calloused hands. This allows you to call for help anywhere in this city, he whispered. The staff, the drivers, the men in the shadows, they all answer to this. You are no longer just a witness to my weakness, Eloan. You are the keeper of my mother's ghost. Eloan looked down at the heavy ring, then at the sprawling stain on his chest. I only wanted to serve the soup, she said softly, her fear finally ebbing into a strange, shared sorrow. You served me the truth, Cassiano replied. He turned to his men, his coat flapping like a dark cape. Clear the room. The Iron Dawn is dead. Tell the city that from tonight, Moretti answers to a higher power. As the enforcers began to usher the stunned patrons out, a new guard formed a silent, impenetrable ring around the Waitress, marking the end of one empire and the birth of a very different, more dangerous kind of devotion. The following week saw a transformation at Loro di Napoli that defied every law of the underworld. The restaurant, once a place of hushed terror and cold transactions, became the unlikely sanctuary of a man trying to remember how to be human. Every morning, before the doors opened to the public, the black armored SUVs would pull up to the curb. But instead of the Iron Dawn emerging to collect tribute or issue threats, Cassiano would step out alone, his suit jacket discarded and his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. Inside the kitchen, the air was a thick, humid swirl of garlic, roasting bones, and the sharp, bright scent of lemon zest. Eloan was no longer a waitress scurrying in the shadows, she had become the teacher to a man who had forgotten the meaning of creation. Cassiano stood at the industrial prep table, his large, scarred hands looking out of place against the delicate piles of flour and herbs. Under Eloan's patient guidance, he learned that the true power of his mother's recipe didn't lie in the ingredients, but in the patience of the process. You're rushing the onions, Cassiano, Eloan would say, her voice firm but gentle, a tone no one had dared use with him in 20 years. They need to sweat, not burn. They need to turn into gold, just like she wrote. Cassiano would nod, his eyes focused on the pan with a searing intensity he usually reserved for war rooms. He found a strange, meditative peace in the repetitive motion of the knife and the steady whistle of the simmering broth. In the steam and the salt, the ghosts of his past felt less like hauntings and more like company. He began to talk, not of hits or territories, but of the way the sunlight used to hit his mother's kitchen floor and the song she hummed when the bread was rising. Outside the kitchen doors, Marco and his men stood like statues, their earpieces humming with chatter about brewing wars and restless rivals, but they remained a wall of silence. They watched through the porthole window in disbelief as their Don, the man who had built an empire on fear, laughed for the first time as Eloan teased him about his clumsy kneading technique. He was trading his iron mask for an apron, finding a quiet victory in the perfect char of a vegetable. But as the aroma of the soup for a brave heart began to fill the alleyways of the district, it didn't just attract memories, it drew the attention of the wolves who had been waiting for the Iron Dawn to finally drop his guard. Under the soft glow of the kitchen lights, Cassiano was finding his soul, unaware that the world he had left behind was preparing to burn the sanctuary down. The warmth of the kitchen was a fragile bubble, and outside its steamed windows, the temperature of the city was dropping. In the windowless backrooms of the dockside warehouses, the syndicate leaders watched the grainy surveillance footage of their Iron Dawn wearing a flour-dusted apron. To them, the sight wasn't touching, it was a death warrant. In the underworld, a man who finds his heart is a man who has provided his enemies with a target. The word had spread through the gutters and the high-rises like a virus. Cassiano Moretti had gone soft, traded his steel for soup, and placed his life in the hands of a girl who knew nothing of the debt of blood. The atmosphere at Loro di Napoli began to sour long before the first shot was fired. The regular patrons, the ones who knew how to read the shadows, stopped coming. Instead, the tables were filled with strangers with hard eyes and heavy coats that didn't quite hide the bulk of what lay beneath. Marco felt the shift in his gut. He stood by the kitchen door, his hand never straying more than an inch from his holster, watching the street through the glass. He had seen this play out a dozen times before, but never with a Don who was so blissfully, dangerously distracted. Inside the kitchen, Cassiano was tasting a broth, a small, genuine smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as Eloan gave a nod of approval. He was miles away, lost in a memory of a Sunday afternoon in Italy. He didn't hear the screech of tires in the alleyway. He didn't see the black sedan skip the curb or the men in tactical gear spilling out like ink into the night. But Eloan saw the change in Marco's face. She saw the way the head of security's posture went from vigilant to lethal in a heartbeat. Cassiano, Marco said, his voice a low, urgent growl that shattered the peace of the prep station. They're here. The Don didn't flinch. He slowly set the tasting spoon down on the stainless steel, the iron mask sliding back over his features with a chilling, familiar ease. The light in his eyes, so warm just moments ago, vanished into a cold, dark vacuum. He looked at Eloan, whose face had gone ashen as the first window in the dining room shattered, followed by the rhythmic, terrifying thunder of automatic fire. The syndicate wasn't just coming for his territory anymore, they were coming to kill the memory he had just found. Get in the walk-in freezer, Cassiano commanded, his voice devoid of heat. Lock it from the inside and don't come out until you hear my voice. Not Marco's. Not the police. Mine. As Eloan was ushered into the cold, the Iron Dawn turned toward the kitchen doors, drawing a heavy silver pistol from the small of his back. The lessons were over. The predator was back, and he was hungry for blood. The heavy steel door of the walk-in freezer hissed shut, sealing Eloan into a world of frost and silence, but the kitchen behind her had already become a symphony of violence. Don Cassiano Moretti did not take cover. He moved with the terrifying, rhythmic grace of a man who had spent more of his life in the dark than the light. The kitchen doors burst open, and 3 syndicate assassins lunged through, their muzzles flashing in the dim fluorescent light. Cassiano didn't flinch. He fired 3 times, the heavy silver pistol barking with a steady, clinical precision. 3 bodies hit the floor before they could even register the man in the apron. Marco. Flank the service bar. Cassiano roared over the thunder of automatic fire. The elegant dining hall of Loro di Napoli was being torn to shreds. Arched windows shattered into glittering diamonds, and marble columns chipped under the relentless spray of lead. The syndicate had sent a small army to snuff out the Dawn's new flame, but they had forgotten that the Iron Dawn was most dangerous when he had something left to lose. He moved through the kitchen like a ghost among the copper pots and pans, using the industrial stove for cover. When his magazine ran dry, Cassiano didn't hesitate. He grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the range, the same one he had used to sauté onions with Eloan only hours before, and swung it with bone-shattering force into the temple of an intruder who had dared to bridge the gap. The metal rang out, a low, resonant chime that signaled the end of the man's life. Cassiano grabbed the fallen mercenary's rifle, his eyes burning with a cold, righteous fury. Every bullet he fired felt like a payment for the 20 years of peace he had been denied. The air grew thick with acrid smoke and the metallic tang of blood, a sharp contrast to the sacred aroma of the minestrone that still lingered in the rafters. The syndicate's lead enforcer, a man known for his cruelty, stepped over the shattered remains of the host stand, his weapon aimed at the freezer door. He knew the Don was protecting something. He leveled his gun, but he never got to pull the trigger. Cassiano stepped out from behind a marble pillar, his face illuminated by the flickering emergency lights. He looked like a demon born of salt and iron. He didn't just stop the assassin, he dismantled the threat with a savagery that made even Marco pause. As the last of the attackers fell and the silence returned to the ruined restaurant, Cassiano stood among the wreckage, his chest heaving. He was covered in soot and crimson, but his first movement wasn't toward his exit or his men. He turned toward the freezer, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle, terrified of what he might find behind the steel. The steel door of the freezer groaned as Cassiano threw it open, his breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts. Eloan scrambled out, the frost still clinging to her hair, her eyes wide with a terror that only deepened when she saw the carnage of the dining hall. But her gaze quickly fell to Cassiano, and a different kind of scream died in her throat. The Don was swaying, his hand pressed firmly against his side where the dark, thick stain of blood was spreading rapidly across his white shirt, far more aggressive than the soup had been. "Cassiano," she cried, rushing to catch him as his knees finally buckled. She lowered him to the floor, her hands hovering over the wound in a panic. The Iron Don was losing his color, his skin turning the shade of ash, but his eyes remained locked on hers with a desperate, lucid intensity. Behind them, the muffled sound of a secondary engine roared in the alley. A lone survivor of the syndicate hit squad had circled back, the barrel of a rifle poking through the shattered remains of a window. Marco was occupied with the wounded on the far side of the room, he wouldn't make it in time. Cassiano saw the movement first. With a low, guttural growl that sounded like a dying lion, he surged upward, using the last of his strength to throw his heavy frame over Eloan. Two sharp cracks echoed through the ruin of Loro di Napoli. Cassiano jerked violently, his body acting as a human shield against the lead that was meant to silence the girl and the journal forever. He slumped into her lap, his weight immense, his breathing now a wet, rattling struggle. Don't let it go out," he gasped, his fingers clawing weakly at the air until they found Eloan's hand. He wasn't talking about his life. He was looking at the kitchen, where the pilot light of the stove still flickered, and the scent of the sacred recipe hung stubbornly in the smoke. The light, her light. Keep it burning." Eloan held him, her tears falling onto his face, washing away the soot and the blood of the man the world called a monster. In this moment, the syndicate hadn't won. They had destroyed the dawn, but they couldn't touch the sun. Cassiano closed his eyes, a strange, peaceful smile touching his lips as the coldness of the floor faded into the imagined warmth of a sun-drenched Italian kitchen. He had paid the ultimate price, not to settle a debt of crime, but to protect the only piece of heaven he had ever known. As sirens began to wail in the distance, the Iron Dawn let out one final, quiet breath, finally free of the mask he had worn for 20 years. The sirens eventually faded into the hum of a city that had no idea its king had fallen, but inside the reconstructed walls of the restaurant, a new kind of power was taking root. 6 months had passed since the night the marble floors were stained with red, yet the air no longer smelled of gunpowder or fear. Instead, the heavy oak doors of the establishment, now renamed La Madre, swung open to the morning sun, releasing the golden, intoxicating aroma of wild oregano and slow-simmered broth. Eloan stood at the pass, no longer wearing the hurried expression of a terrified waitress, but the calm authority of a woman who had inherited a soul. Beside her, the industrial stove hummed with life. The ironclad rule of the underworld had been replaced by a different kind of discipline, the precision of a recipe that demanded love over ego. Cassiano had survived that night, though the Iron Dawn had not. The bullets had taken his strength, but they had also severed the final threads connecting him to the syndicate. He had used his recovery to dismantle the Moretti Empire, funneling the remains of a violent fortune into a foundation that fed the hungry and protected the vulnerable, effectively erasing the devil from the city's ledger. Now, in the quiet of the morning, Cassiano emerged from the back office. He walked with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of his sacrifice, but the cold, chiseled mask of his face had softened into something human. He didn't wear a bespoke suit or carry a silver pistol. He wore a simple linen shirt and a clean apron, his hands, once stained with the ink of crime, now dusted with the white flour of the day's bread. He walked to the center of the kitchen and paused, closing his eyes to inhale the steam rising from the large ceramic pots. He reached out and took Aloan's hand, his fingers calloused but incredibly gentle. They looked toward the far wall, where a framed photograph of his mother sat beside the old, oilcloth-wrapped journal. Her smile seemed to bless the steam and the salt of the room. Cassiano realized that true legacy wasn't found in territory or the fear of one's name, it was found in the ability to bow to the truth of one's heart. He was no longer the man who cleared streets, he was the man who filled tables. As the first customers began to trickle in, not gangsters, but families and neighbors, Cassiano took his place at the stove. He wasn't ruling an underworld, he was honoring a memory, proving that even the hardest iron can be forged into something that nourishes the world. The Iron Dawn was gone, but the sun had finally come home, leaving a legacy of soup, salt, and a brave heart that would never be forgotten.